From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome back to the show. So can you believe it's the middle of August already? It's almost Labor Day. You know, I can't wait till next year because it's going to be so luxurious to have all that extra time. I don't know if you missed it or not, but the Chicago Public Schools solved the biggest problem we all have, not having enough time. They invented the 14-month year. So how are you going to spend those extra 8 weeks? Well, the Chicago Public Schools, already the creators of the longer school day, they're going to devote those extra 56 days or so to waiting around for money to roll in. But there is one small problem, that is, unless they can convince everybody else in the world to let 2015 run a little longer so they can capture the tax money from the following year, you know. Unless they can do that, the next fiscal year is only going to be 10 months long, right? I mean, I'm not absolutely sure about that, but I do have a Chicago Public Schools education, and if it serves me right, that's what we're going to have. So what are we going to do in the 10-month year? Well, perhaps it won't matter because it'll all happen after Rahm Emanuel's safely reelected, and we all know that Rahm can solve pretty much any problem, so should be no problem, right? On the show today to help us understand CPS budgeting and this new innovation and all the things that tumble from it are Sarah Karp, once again. Glad to have you back from Catalyst Chicago.
Nice
Always
to be
good
here.
to have you back on the show. And Kate Grossman joining us again. Happy to have you back. Kate Grossman, editorial page deputy editor, Chicago Sun-Times, responsible for helping us all keep things in perspective and what we're supposed to know about the world, right?
I can try.
Yeah, you do the best you can. So we kid the Board of Education about their 14-month year, but they really did do this, right? I mean, there really are. So I just paid my property taxes like everybody else, and I assume that this stuff rolls in by the billions once or twice a year. So if you hold your basket out 3 times instead of 2 times, don't you have only one basket the next year? I mean, is it just that simple?
You know, I honestly racked my brain. I kept trying to understand how this works, how they wouldn't be shortchanged.
Yeah.
So the basic concept is they used to end their fiscal year, I think at the end of August. They've extended the fiscal year for another 60 days so they can capture money that is essentially into the FY15 fiscal year. So they get an extra, I don't remember, significant amount of money. A lot of money.
Sure.
And so they kept assuring, they being CPS folks, that this wouldn't hurt us in fiscal year 15, that it was just a one-time windfall. But I honestly can't get my head around how you aren't, $300 million short in the next fiscal year.
Well, $300, $500, $700 million short, that's kind of the, that's
Right.
the
I mean,
way it
the
works.
one thing that they said in their defense was that this is the policy, this elongated calendar. Maybe we should call it the full calendar. It wasn't the longer school day, it was the full school day.
Right. So this is the full year.
Yeah. That this is the practice, I guess, in other city agencies and,
It
Cook
is?
County. Yeah, apparently. And it's only, now they can do it because starting the last couple of years for the first time in, since you and I were in diapers, they actually get the property tax bill out early enough so that they can get the money in early, which is a really,
That Tony
very
Kretschenko, I'll
positive
tell
development.
you. Yeah,
and
yeah.
Joe Barrios,
And
to
Joe
his
Barrios,
assessor, to
yeah.
his credit.
Yeah.
So, the bottom line is this is yet another. Every year they have a $1 billion plus deficit, and they pull a rabbit out of the hat and say, "Oh, we have $600 million in reserves. We're going to spend it all."
Right.
And I'm sure you probably feel the same way. I believe that there is a genuine deficit. There's no question that they need to spend more than they have coming in. But every year they manage to pull a rabbit out of the hat. And so you think, well, what's going to be the rabbit? There's going to be some other rabbit next year, which makes their crying wolf feel a little.
But it sounds like, and of course, everything I know because I read stuff that you guys print. So, I don't do original reporting on this. I just parrot stuff you say. But it sounds like the plan is to, with the new political capital of a newly elected mayor and a newly reelected governor, to just say, okay, we're going to pass all this pension reform stuff now, and then that's going to put a lot of relief on the budget, and then they're going to be fine and they'll skate through this. But if that really is the plan, that seems to me like there's a few holes in that plan.
Yeah, and I actually think that the plan is a little bit more that next year, when the CTU negotiations will be in full swing, that they'll be able to cry wolf even louder. So I think that that's sort of what they're counting on. Is
So
that
they kind of need this.
they need a budget
need to
crisis,
be
like they
more-
did,
right,
like right when Rahm came to office before.
yeah.
It was the exact same thing.
Yeah.
He said, "Oh, we have no money. We can't pay your 4% raises,"
Right,
and
right.
you know, and it's a choice either between the parents. Do we have to either raise class sizes, or we got to give teachers, these greedy teachers, a raise? And so we're in the middle of this. And what will be interesting is if Rahm doesn't become mayor and maybe somebody else becomes mayor, how that person will deal with it. But
what's going to be more interesting than even that is that other person who's running for mayor might be the one he's sitting across the table with. I mean, you could have Karen Lewis and Rahm Emanuel negotiating with each other while they're running against each other for mayor.
Right, although they're likely to avoid that scenario. I think
They themselves wouldn't sit at the table.
yeah,
I'm
well,
sure.
but I think the negotiations actually would start post-election.
You think so?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. The only thing, to be fair, there is a genuine budget crisis. There's no question. And, and we on the editorial page have supported reducing the pensions for Chicago public school teachers as much as we hate to do it. And it's unsustainable, and it's not the teachers' fault, and CPS screwed them, and the state screwed them, and all those reasons. There's a million things, but they don't have enough money. And if you want to make sure the pension system remains solvent, you have two choices. You either flood it with new revenue, or you cut pensions, or maybe you do some combination. But something has to give.
That is kind of the conversation ender to all of these things, right? Because it always comes down to that. Yeah, something's got to give. But I mean, we have just a fascinating political situation here where you've got a guy running for governor who your paper says is probably going to win, at least if you look at the polls, who is a avowed charter advocate. And you have a woman running for mayor who your paper says could win, who is
and the Tribune actually had a
and
poll
now
today.
The Tribune is saying the same thing. Yeah. So I mentioned on the show the other day the weirdness of the possibility that Mayor Lewis would have to deal with Governor Rauner.
It would be hilarious. It would be hilarious. I really, as much as sometimes I'm like, oh, am I sick of covering Chicago public schools? I would stay around to cover, because I think that would just be fascinating and interesting and crazy. I think, the state has this Illinois Charter School Commission, right, that can authorize charters to go into. I would be nervous that Chicago would suddenly get all these charters that they didn't want. It would be sort of like the Wild Wild West, schools opening up without CPS knowing anything about it, or it would be sort of crazy.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons that I wanted to have you guys on the show today is because it's been dawning on me, maybe a year too late, that one of the really big issues in the CPS story is this student-based budgeting thing that was just kind of, I mean, as I recall it, we all had our attention focused on a million other things at the time with the contract and the strike and everything. And then almost immediately after that, in the backwash from that, Barbara Byrd Bennett announced this thing that seems so eminently fair and reasonable. We're going to start giving schools money according to how many students they have instead of whatever Byzantine method they were using before. Sure, sounds reasonable. But now we're beginning to see the results of that, and the results are kind of stunning in a way. Am I going down the wrong road here?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it is, the concept is very fair, right? You know, $6,000 follows Sarah, she goes to this school or she chooses that school. And the problem is that it's, whatever the amount is not enough. And so when Sarah chooses school B over school A and her money leaves, it was never even enough at your original school. And so the loss of those dollars is really devastating. And it's sort of this downward cycle, right? If a school starts losing enrollment, they were probably already struggling anyway because they were under-resourced, and then they lose money, and then then they lose programming and teachers, and then they can't recruit more kids, and it's, it has a really devastating impact on a school. But this student-based budgeting, what Chicago's been moving towards is this choice system, away from the neighborhood-based schools and towards, you can choose a charter, you can choose a magnet, selective enrollment, magnet fine arts, lots of choices. And having this student-based budgeting is like the linchpin of letting that system flourish.
Exactly.
Right, and I think that's why we kind of missed it, or the significance of it, because that, if you think about it, that allows for choice, right? So you take your dollars and you can choose. And again, in theory, it's a great idea, but in an under-resourced school system, it's devastating for schools that lose enrollment. It's often through no fault of their own.
Well, in this last budget, depending on how you view the value of charter schools, according to Catalyst, I'm using Catalyst as my source on this, $62 million of this last budget more went to charters, and $67 million less went, or $67 million less was given to the neighborhood schools.
And the interesting thing is that sort of is accounted for because of differences in enrollment, but it's not entirely accounted for because of differences in enrollment. So CPS, on top of the student-based budget amount, gives charter schools a lump sum extra. And what they say is that their argument for that is that there's a lot of in-kind services that traditional CPS schools get. And so we need to make up for that. A whole bunch of different items. But it's about $2,000 more than the base student-based budgeting that charter schools are getting. And that money actually increased this year. That extra, it's called non-student-based budgeting that goes to charter schools. That increased this year compared to last year. So, there is a reason that charter schools, on top of their enrollment, which they are increasing in enrollment, are getting more money. So it's interesting. It's about priorities, and there's an ideology too. Chicago Public Schools leadership and Rahm Emanuel are supportive of charter schools. And if you talk to charter school operators, they'll say that they don't get enough money to run their schools. But they probably have some of the same complaints as the CPS traditional school principals. And they are out recruiting like crazy too. It is a fight for students. We are, hearing from principals who have teachers going door to door, and we're hearing from charter schools, they're going door to door. Imagine you're a parent and you're getting flyers every other, especially if you're in an area that is, got both schools at play, because some areas don't. There's some neighborhoods in Chicago that don't have many charter schools, but where you do, and where you have like dwindling population, and in my neighborhood, there's actually, quite a few charter schools and quite a few neighborhood schools. I'm getting flyers. I'm getting phone calls. I'm getting, you think it's hard to get into a charter school? I would argue against that because, I've been offered seats at schools for my children, I've been offered seats at schools I didn't even apply for. It's basically like, please, is your child breathing? Come bring him, and it's quite a phenomenon.
Yeah, well, and certainly we know that the principals of the whatever you want to call them, the traditional neighborhood elementary schools are out there beating the bushes trying to find people. And the much maligned Chicagoland thing with Liz Dozier, the principal, Chicago's principal, her school lost hundreds and hundreds of people, and she's out there trying to find people and so forth. But
can I throw in one thing about the charters, because I feel like it often gets lost. There's a lot of fixation on charters, appropriately, but it's the loss in the neighborhood schools is not just about charters. It's parents choosing a selective school, a magnet school.
Right.
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but those are equal numbers in terms of draining kids from neighborhood schools as they are, how charters drain.
Right.
So I think they get knocked a lot, charters, but it's
true.
That's not parents are making a lot of choices away from the neighborhood schools, and they're not just charters.
It's true. I was just going to say, a few years ago I did an analysis, and CPS actually can tell you exactly how many kids in the neighborhood are going to charters and how many are going to magnets and how many, and the charter school effect in elementary schools is only about 20%. of neighborhood school loss is only about 20%, and that's even in the neighborhoods where there's a lot of charter schools. So there's also a population loss in a lot of neighborhoods. So that's making even more students a commodity.
So what's accounting for the rest if the charters are 20? It's all the other things.
It's all the other. It's
magnets
the magnets. It's the selectives, and population loss is a big deal.
Loss,
It's a big thing.
Yeah.
So
well, I was just. My mind was just going back to sitting at this table a couple of years ago with J.C. Brizard when he was here, and mentioning to him that, I spent all my time in Chicago Public Schools. I went to Stowe Elementary, and when it came time to go to high school, several of the counselors called me in and said, your neighborhood high school is Kelvin Park. And if you go there, you will probably get killed. I mean, it is a horrible place. Now, we're talking 1962, 63 here, right? You must not go there. You've got to go someplace else. So I ended up going to vocational high school and outside of the neighborhood. This is what my point is. This is not new. This has been going on forever and ever and ever. But instead of attempting, and this is the question, this is the big question to me, instead of attempting to do something to repair or fix these schools, it appears to me that the administration, this new administration, has just simply given up and said, we're going to basically drive the engine toward privatizing this thing and getting more and more private operators, I call them quasi-private operators in here to run the system. I mean, is that unfair?
I think that's mostly the truth. I mean, there's clearly been, they tried a bunch of things over the years with neighborhood high schools, reconstitution, whatever. There's like a million different names. And, starting with this Renaissance 2010 program, which was, I remember because my first daughter was born, I think it was 2005, right?
Yeah, around
or
there.
Second. So that's been the track, shut down low-performing schools, replace them with new models. Now, if Rahm Emanuel were sitting right here, he'd say, well, we are investing in our neighborhood schools. We have IB, International Baccalaureate, we have early college, we have STEM. And that is true, but I see those as like little droplets,
Yeah.
I mean, even I did an editorial last year about Lakeview High School, which is a neighborhood high school that's really trying to break into the sort of upper tier. And they got, I think it's an early college STEM program, and so they got a big investment of new science labs and all that. But at the same time, this was a year ago, because of student-based budgeting and because of budget cuts, their budget got whacked. So that really undercut their effort to make a successful, which on paper looked great, like an early college STEM program. I'm going to sign my kid up, but then it turns out they had to cut teachers, and so you kind of layer these things on top, but what's the foundation, in these schools?
It's interesting, as I've said, one of the benefits or whatever of getting older is that you see these cycles, these pendulum swings just back and forth.
Depressing, isn't it?
Yeah, and as you say, in 2000 and maybe couple of years before that, the mantra was, we've got to make schools smaller. They're too big, they're too impersonal. We've got to break up these monster schools like Lakeview and others. And now we're seeing people look at this and they're saying, well, if you look at like ETHS or, New Trier or even for that matter, some of the newer, Northside College Prep, these are big schools with big populations. And there's a huge benefit to this. Not only can they be more diverse, their populations can really be diverse and you can rub shoulders with all kinds of different people, but you can have swimming pools and gyms and basketball teams and chess teams, and you can't have that when you're a little tiny high school of 100 people.
Right, and what's interesting is about a year ago, I was interviewing Karen Lewis about something else, and I mentioned to her what's going to happen with neighborhood high schools, and she said that her and Barbara Bird Bennett are meeting together and working on a plan about neighborhood high schools, and I never heard a word more about that. So, I mean, I do point out every time I can get a chance that there's really not a stated plan for neighborhood high school. What is the plan? I mean, a Bowen, right? Or a Corliss, or a Hope, or a Robeson, or a Marshall. What is the plan? I mean, I suspect that there's some people who think that there should be selective enrollments, magnets, charters, alternatives, and that the neighborhood high schools are going to be akin to alternative schools and maybe run by private operators eventually. But the
So
problem
is
is
it fair
that
to call those schools of last resort?
well, I think they've been, like you said before, I think they've been schools of last resort for a long time. I think that they're like schools of the, of the last resort.
Right,
Maybe
it's
even,
gotten worse.
maybe even, the schools of for failing kids or, kids that are troublemakers. I mean, charter schools are really pulling that, whereas there's always been selective and magnet schools, they're pulling that tier of like
the middle tier,
the C
yeah,
students
yeah,
out
yeah,
of neighborhood schools.
And there's also a really deeply cynical piece of me that says that this really has been the plan all along. It's like you can talk about the charters and everything, but there's really a triage mentality here. It's like we need to segregate out the worst of the worst kids, the kids who can't perform, who have no parental involvement, and just segregate them into these horrible schools and then just
I
walk
think it's
away.
like the reverse, basically. It's the triage. Let's save the kids that are savable. I don't think anyone sits around and thinks like, let's put all the like terrible poor students like.
Okay.
I think it's an obvious consequence that anyone who decides they're going to start pulling out the higher performing kids, if anyone had given it a minute's thought, would see this is going to be the obvious consequence, and we can't have that. I mean, we have it, and it's outrageous.
We do have it. Yeah.
But I think it's more that the thinkers behind this is like, let's save the kids that we can, and then what happens is, and I think this always like really frustrates me, when you have schools that are low performing, whatever, Finger or, I mean, what do you expect? You look at the kids who are coming into the building, they're coming in so far behind grade level, and then you whack these schools because the kids are low performing. Well, I mean, and a lot of schools make nice progress with the kids, but I mean, it's outrageous to me to blame these schools when you've drained away all the higher performing kids, and this is who they are educating, and then you blame them for what we've handed them. I just think that's profoundly unfair and leads to all these punitive measures on these schools that mostly are counterproductive and don't recognize that this is a very distinct, like you're saying about alternative schools, these are a very distinct student population that has very intense needs that you have to deal with, not punish them for it.
And I'll just revisit this for one more moment and say that I do think that there is something very positive, almost magical about the really well done, huge schools. I mean, I'm thinking of Schurz, for example, where they just put, a few years ago, they put like, $20 million or something into that school, rebuilt it completely. It's got a pipe organ in the auditorium. I mean, these can be inspiring places if they're well run and well maintained, and they have good programming in them. They can be much more inspiring than a storefront school.
And beyond that, I think that they can bring communities together, especially high schools.
Absolutely.
A lot of the high schools in Chicago actually have fairly strong alumni groups that are, sort of fighting for them quietly. But, when you take that away, and there's, with charter schools pulling from all over the city, you wonder, will they have those type of ties to the neighborhood, to the community, to, to people's memories?
Yeah.
Or, how is that going to exist, 10 years down the road?
You were one of the panelists at First Tuesday at the Hideout a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was Ben Joravsky asked each of you the sort of binary question: how much longer will Barbara Byrd Bennett be in office? And you said,
I said I think she'll stay till at least February. I mean, I think she'll stay till after the election.
She'll stick around till after the election.
I think that it would. I mean, and I have no tea leaves, but I sort of feel like it would be bad for Rahm if she left. However, there's been a lot of turnover in the CPS administration. His deputy chief of staff left, and now he's a new deputy chief of staff, and there's all these all these internal changes. So you wonder if there's something sort of boiling there, but I just think it would look bad if she left. I mean, it just caused another layer of controversy. Then he's got to choose somebody, and I feel like she's probably given him her word that she'll stay post-election, but I don't know that for a fact. So.
What do you think?
Yeah, I would assume she would stay through the election, and I also could see from a personal perspective. I mean, she started October. It'll be 2 years ago in this October. And she basically just walked into this nightmare of the school closings, and that was her entire first year. And then obviously last year was a lot calmer, but still, I mean, I would think professionally she's got some ideas about things she wants to do, and if she stays through another full school year, I think she'd probably have some feeling like that maybe she left some measure of herself or her ideas on the school system. Again, I don't have any insight beyond, but I just think, she's been, obviously Emmanuel is very overbearing when it comes to the schools, and her freedom is limited in that regard. But she's, obviously been around a long time and has a lot of ideas about how schools should be run, and I imagine she'd like to leave more of a stamp than she's been able to.
I mean, I have the impression that they're pretty much like this as far as their philosophy of how to run a school system.
I don't know if that's accurate. I mean, I think she's certainly not a big fan of charter schools.
Barbara Byrd Bennett is not?
She claims to be agnostic about school type, but she would never be out there leading the charge. And in fact, to her credit, in part because there's so much backlash, I mean, CPS has scaled back the pace of charter expansion.
Yeah,
I mean, it's still
still
high,
expanding,
but
it
has tamped down the last 2 years. So she claims, and I think it's genuine, whether she's a big supporter of neighborhood schools. I don't know how much she's going to be able to do in that regard, but she's a former principal. She knows the score about what happens when you drain all the top kids.
One of the things I wanted to talk with you today about is the rising voice of principals. We don't have any time. We're out of time, but that is a really significant thing to me about how principals are becoming more involved. Okay, 30 seconds. We have to do the politics thing. Does Karen Lewis have a shot at mayor?
I guess so, shockingly. I wouldn't think that she would. I mean, if you would have asked me, last year, I would have said probably not. But I guess all the polls are saying that she does. And I mean, there's enough discontent. It's just that, it's very hard for me to see someone who's never really been elected to a real office being now Chicago mayor. That's a pretty big jump.
Kate, the last 15 seconds.
I think she has a shot.
Really? You could envision Karen Lewis as our mayor?
I think the people would vote for her.
See, this is it. You're seeing something. I mean, it really is stunning to me to see how low Rahm Emanuel's numbers are. It's incredible. All right, we have done it. We're out of time. Thank you, Sarah Karp. Thank you, Kate Grossman, for being here today. Sun-Times Catalyst. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can see us anytime on TV. But if you go to this address, you can watch us right then and there on your device, whatever your device happens to be. Or you can check us out on iTunes. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks for watching us. See you next week on, what is the name of the show? Oh, yeah, Chicago Newsroom. See you next week. Bye.